Well, hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Smoke and Mirrors. This is a webinar about exposing the PR tactics of the pesticide industry. And it's great to have so many people joining us. We had literally hundreds of people sign up for the event, so it's really testament to how relevant Silent Spring and Rachel Carson is today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Keith Tyrrell, and I'm the director of Pan UK. And Pan UK is the only charity in the UK that works solely on pesticides, tackling the problems that they cause. And our goals are very much in line with Silent Spring's call to action. We want to see an end to the use of highly hazardous pesticides, a massive reduction in reliance on synthetic pesticides, and their replacement with ecologically sound and socially just methods of pest control. So in effect, what we want to see is a switch to a farming system that works in harmony with nature and works for communities, not for corporations. And we're here today to celebrate the 60th anniversary tomorrow of a truly remarkable book. Silent Spring has variously been credited with kickstarting the environmental movement or waking up humanity to the fragility of the natural systems that surround us. It challenged the pioneer mentality that viewed, and in some circles still views, nature as solely an asset to be exploited and dominated. So when I first read Silent Spring 30 odd years ago now, I was a undergraduate scientist, and I viewed it very much as a scientific book. I viewed it as quite simply something that looked at the impact of chemicals on the environment. But as time's gone on, I've come to realize that it's so much more than this. It's really about nothing less than our relationship with the natural world. It's about power. It's about in whose interest decisions are made. And that's what makes it such a really dangerous and radical book. Rachel Carson shone a light on the cozy relationship between regulators and industry, and exposed how companies spread misinformation to keep their products on the market, while regulators are just too happy to accept claims unquestioningly. And make no mistake, there are two villains here. If this was a podcast, a true crime podcast, which I think would be a brilliant one, by the way, you would really see who the villains are really quickly. It's the companies who play fast and loose with the science to keep their products on the market, but it's also the governments who just sit on their hands and let them do it. And as an aside, in the UK, I'm going to digress a bit for those of you in the US, but in the UK, today we've just heard that after years of negotiations and discussions, the government's caved into vested interest and has thrown the new environmental land management scheme in the bin. This was a scheme that was going to overhaul the subsidies for farming so that farming worked for nature and for farmers. And so sometimes conversations around corporate capture can seem a bit abstract and distant, but this is really what corporate capture looks like. But back to the pesticide industry, I think it's really important to be really clear and to make no mistake that the pesticide industry knows that their products are dangerous. They know that ultimately their products are going to be banned and taken off the market. And why can I say this with such confidence? I mean, quite simply because that's what happens over and over and over again. A pesticide is developed, a pesticide look the other way, and eventually the weight of scientific evidence becomes impossible to ignore and the product is banned. The real question here is how long it takes between a problem being discovered and regulators taking action. And sadly, it's usually decades during which time ecosystems are ravaged, people are made sick, and in fact, people are killed. So the industry's objective in this model is not, I repeat, it's not to prevent a ban. They know that is inevitable. It's really just to delay the inevitable. It's to buy time. It's time during which they can continue selling their products. And the economic case for this is just crystal clear. A single active ingredient, a single pesticide, the global market for which is hundreds of thousands of pounds, sometimes billions. So it really makes absolutely perfect economic sense to keep it on the market for as long as possible. The research and development costs have long been written off. The factories that make them have been built in some cases decades ago. So all of the capital costs have gone. All that's left is operating costs. This is as close to pure profit as you can get in this business. So if the industry can keep the product on the market for a year, for a month, for a day, by sowing doubt, by undermining credibility of its critics, by overinflating the benefits, it equates to literally millions in profits. And that's just from a single product. So this explains really why industry acted with such fury to silence Spring, attacking Rachel Carson mercilessly, deploying tactics that have been refined and rolled out again and again by vested interests, whether they're big tobacco or big oil, hell-bent on making money regardless of the costs to society or the environment. And with me tonight, or this morning, depending on where you are, to discuss the tactics that have been used by the industry and actually by a lot of other industries these days, are three amazing women who each have first-hand experience of the tactics and have spent years researching and exposing them. So I'd like to welcome Carey Gillam, Anna Lappé, and Jennifer Jacquet. So I'll invite Carey to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her and her work.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Keith. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for a really long time, more than 30 years. I spent 17 years with Reuters International News Service, and then went to work for the nonprofit US Right to Know for a few years and started freelancing for The Guardian. And I now do quite a bit of my work for The Guardian news outlet. And I am managing editor for a new little journalism initiative of the environmental working group that we call The New Lead. So I hope that people will check that out. The New Lead is quite an environmentally focused, justice for all sort of outlet, very much in the legacy of Rachel Carson. I've written 2 books. You talked about, we've all experienced the sort of, agrochemical industry playbook. And I certainly did that when I wrote my first book, which was called Whitewash. It came out in 2017. And this really was an expose about the chemical glyphosate and how Monsanto had spent decades really manipulating the scientific literature, manipulating regulators, hiding information from consumers and lawmakers and others. And the company really came after me hard. And, we were able to see some internal documents where they lay out their strategy for discrediting me, discrediting the book, emails showing payments to front groups, just a whole very elaborate scheme that, we see play out across different industries and different product lines. So I'm sure we'll talk about all that today, but I thank you very much for having me here. I tried to be inspired by Rachel Carson in writing Whitewash and quoted her several times throughout the book. And it's really great to honor her legacy in this way today. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Carey. That's great. And if you haven't read her book, I really do encourage you to do so. It's another thing that should be an amazing true crime podcast. I'm sorry, it's great. Anna, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Keith. Hi, everyone. As Keith said, my name is Anna Lappé, and it is such a huge honor to be here today. As Carey was saying about her relationship to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, the same is true for me. It's been a book I return to every couple years, and every time I do, I'm just amazed again at Rachel Carson's foresight and her wisdom and her artistry as a writer. And this is the book, if those of you who are tuning in, you might have a copy of Silent Spring nearby, or you might be looking to get one in this issue. It's Rachel Carson, Silent Spring and Other Writings, edited by Sandra Steingraber. But to be celebrating this book today with Jennifer and Carey feels particularly special, because I really see the work that both Carey and Jennifer do through their research and their writing as really carrying on Rachel Carson's tradition. So just a few more words about me. I have been working on kind of exploring and advocating food systems transformation for a couple decades now. First with a book I wrote 22 years ago called Hope's Edge. That was an exploration of where in the world are there examples of communities that are actually building sustainable food systems, that are actually confronting some of the challenges that Keith talked about in terms of pressure from industry to shape food systems reliant on fossil fuels. And of course, petrochemicals, agrochemicals are just another branch of that fossil fuel tree. I've written a couple other books and more recently have been working as an advisor to funders to explore how can we support the social change agents and the advocacy groups that are really, again, really very much carrying on Rachel Carson's tradition and her words of wisdom. And when I think about my relationship to this work, it is really personal for me. I was raised by my father, who was a toxicologist and epidemiologist, and much of his work over the years was exposing and tracking communities impacted by chemicals, and often that was farm worker communities impacted by the use of pesticides. So from a very young age, I was hearing about the impacts of chemicals like pesticides, and seeing people like my father and others really trying to use every tool available, from the court system to exposés and investigative journalism, to try to both expose the harm of these pesticides and to show that there is another way. Over the years also, I have been so interested in tracking and understanding how the industry shapes what we know, what we believe, and I'm really excited to dig into that and be part of this conversation today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anna. And Jennifer, could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, thanks. I hope you can hear me. I live in New York, where there is never a dull moment, and there's some crazy noises going on right now. But I'm Jennifer Jacquet. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies here at New York University. I have read Anna and Carey's work. I admire it greatly. I've, of course, read Rachel Carson, and I work on large-scale cooperation dilemmas, environmental dilemmas, primarily starting with overfishing, actually. And I worked as part of my PhD in this lab called the Sea Around Us Project, which was named after another book of Rachel Carson's, The Sea Around Us. And she was this, remarkable writer, remarkable woman. And it was easy for me to think, especially, as the allegations against her somewhat percolate, and they called her, the chemical industry called her a spinster, they called her emotional, they called her hysterical. But I remember thinking when I was working on my books, Rachel Carson, she didn't have kids and she didn't have a husband. And so she had all this extra time to write these incredible books. And then I couldn't have been more wrong as I've dug in and learned more about her personal life, at how thin she was stretched. And she had to take care of her mother. She had to take care of a nephew. She had to pay the bills. She also worked, for the US government to actually pay the bills. And so you really realize that this is a woman who comes at this with passion, with a desire and a need, a necessity to fight. And in fact, writing a book was probably the last thing that she had time to do. And so when you start to see Silence Spring through that lens, I think it becomes even more admirable the amount of dedication. And of course, then she was also personally ill toward the end of her life, and still working and cranking out really important intellectual work. So I admire her very much, and I'm honored to be part of this event. I'll just mention that the book that I put out under much less duress earlier this summer is called The Playbook: How to Deny Science, Sell Lies and Make a Killing in the Corporate World. The subtitle was not mine, but I'll take it. It's written as a corporate consultant, as an alter ego, and it is advising companies on how to avoid and combat the threat of regulations that are based on scientific evidence. So if you want to know how to attack journalists like Carey Gillam, who may come after your product, this is the book for you. And I'm sure you'll hear more about some of these strategies in this meeting today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation today, and I'm really hoping that everyone feels free to chat about their experiences so far. And one thing that jumped out at me when you were giving your introduction, Anna, was about how the industry shapes what we think. And I'd really like to understand how powerful you think the industry is in shaping narratives around food, farming, and health.
I'm incredibly powerful. I often think about how industry shapes what we think, what we believe, as kind of like an iceberg. Like what you see above the surface is just one piece of it, and that's, you know, the obvious things like advertising, right? We see that, we think we see an ad from a pesticide company in a magazine in farm country telling farmers that their pesticides are safe and that you need them in order to have an abundant crop. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and then everything beneath that is the kind of corporate tactics that Jennifer writes about in her work, that Carey has certainly dealt with as a journalist, and that she's uncovered and exposed. And that is a whole world of individuals, institutions, organizations, networks, highly networked firms, that's kind of on the most like upper level, close to the tip, close to above the surface, are groups like trade associations. So these are groups that work for the pesticide industry, and they come together to advocate and to lobby. But then as you go kind of deeper into the dark ocean, there are these groups that are less obviously tied, and they're really intentionally less obvious tied. So front groups, organizations with names like the, you know, American Council for Science and Health, that sounds like it maybe is an arbiter for public interest, but actually is funded by corporations. You go deeper down, and there's all these ways in which we see how industry has used third-party allies, you know, paying academics but hiding it under the rug, or other ways in which they've shaped the science. Again, Carey has written about this a lot in terms of how the science was shaped around the herbicide glyphosate. And I think those of us who care about really exposing the truth, particularly in this conversation about pesticides, which is that no, all pesticides are not safe, and no, we do not need them to feed the world. That it's really important that we understand the kinds of things that you know, that Jennifer, Carey, and I talk a lot about, which is how media is shaped, how public information is shaped, and how a lot of these dominant narratives become like the air we breathe. We don't even realize that they have been messages that have been intentionally massaged. So we could give you lots of examples, but again, it's all this work that happens, you know, deep beneath the surface. You know, everything from you know, small things like Monsanto funding K through 12 curriculum into schools, to much bigger things like shaping the direction of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. But that's kind of a little bit of the framework that I like to use.
Carey, I noticed Anna mentioned you there, your work. Could you give us a little bit about what happened with you when you were researching what was happening with glyphosate?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, it begins many, many years ago. I was hired by Reuters to move. I was covering big bank holding companies on the East Coast, and I was hired to move to Kansas and start covering this company named Monsanto. This was in the late 1990s, and they, you know, were really in the news a lot because of their rollout of genetically engineered crops. And of course, these genetically engineered crops were designed to be used specifically with glyphosate. So it was not only about the crops, but it was about selling this chemical glyphosate and expanding Monsanto's reach with this. So I had to learn everything. I didn't know anything about Monsanto. I had to learn, and they embraced me, and they brought me into their headquarters and said, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about these chemicals and these crops. And they did, you know, they had me there many times and took me through their labs and had me talk to their scientists. And that was sort of, I guess, the carrot. I experienced the stick as I continued to become more familiar and research and talk to scientists and farmers, and to understand that this chemical glyphosate wasn't nearly as safe and, you know, wonderful a tool to all of mankind as what Monsanto told me it was. And so then I started to see the flip side, and it's just grown over the years. it's harassment, it's personal attacks, going to editors at Reuters, trying to get me fired, trying to get me removed from my beat, funding front groups that write horrible, false accusations against me and place those over the internet. There was a time when any webinar that I would be invited to speak on, or any prominent place where I was invited to speak, they would go to the organizers or the board of directors and malign me, basically try to keep me silent, or try to silence me. And when my first book came out, Whitewash, as I mentioned earlier, we found they had a PR company in Washington, D.C. that was working on a Carey Gillam action plan. There was a whole scheme to flood Amazon with negative book reviews. They funded a group that wrote a negative book review about me and then tried to push that out through channels. They talked in one of their plans about trying to sort of engineer Google search, search engine optimization, so that terrible things about me would pop up if somebody Googled my name as opposed to my word, just a whole array of tactics. And I felt it, certainly. And when I was able to see the documents and see the levels they went to try to, again, discredit me, discredit my work, it really was, kind of overwhelming and eye-opening to see one company just go after one person like that. And I think the lesson there, or why that's so illustrative, is because I'm one little reporter, and we know that they have similarly gone after other journalists, that they've gone after scientists, importantly, scientists from around the world. And, there are a lot of people who have found it easier to be silent, to step back, to redirect their work, rather than continue to face this barrage of false accusations. So, I could go on and on and on about that, I guess, but that's a little bit. I've seen it firsthand, and it's impressive. It's a big undertaking that they do to try to hit who they perceive as a threat to their business.
I'll just jump in and say that my students are always impressed that Monsanto's document, to take on Whitewash, their strategic communications document is 20 pages long. I mean, this is not something that they're doing in their spare time. They're dedicating an enormous amount of effort. And the chemical company did this. Chemical companies went after Silent Spring in the same way. And one of the things that they did that I think is really telling for especially today's world is they threatened groups or outlets that would run positive reviews and or stories about Rachel Carson, including 60 Minutes, with removing their advertising. So you see the effects of ad-based revenue and media coverage, and that link between the power and how media cannot speak truth to power with this kind of financial arrangement.
I mean, at Little Pen, we have even had little experiences ourselves, but at least we're a group together. We're an organization and we have our friends. But as an individual journalist, it must have been absolutely terrifying and really oppressive. So I'm full of respect and amazement that you managed to hold it together, Carey, under this onslaught.
Truthfully, it did get really, really difficult at times, just where I did have that, gosh, wouldn't it be better to maybe just go do something else and not spend years of my life digging into this subject and exposing it and writing about it. But that other part of me, which is like, what, the more they come after me, the more I'm gonna stand up and keep going. So it works both ways, I think, sometimes.
And how effective do you think these strategies are?
Yeah, well, I was going to jump in to say, I mean, yes, when I hear you tell your story, Carey, and I've read these internal documents, and which are publicly available now, thanks to the litigation around glyphosate, and just to think what you were up against, and it always raises for me this question of, what are the stories we are not hearing because people don't have the kind of courage you had, Carey, or because of, concern about what it might do to them financially or for their careers? And all the books that have not been written or not been published, all the articles that have not been carried through and published. And I was telling Keith about an experience that my own family had, where my father wrote a book in 2002 called Against the Grain. I don't know if you ever saw it, Carey, in your work on GMOs, but it was really kind of one of the early scientific attempts to kind of evaluate these allegations from industry that these genetically modified organisms would actually create higher yielding crops, and that, you know, they were sort of delivering on their alleged promise to address hunger around the world. And so he and his colleague did some research and pulled together some analysis of the research that was out there. The book was ready to go to print, and he had some mainstream New York City publisher ready to print it. And the publisher got a detailed, lengthy, I think it was 17-page letter from Monsanto lawyers saying, if you publish this, we will come after you. And my father always said, reading the letter, it was really clear that they hadn't actually even really read the book, but just knew that it wasn't going to be positive to them. And his publisher balked. His publisher said, look, Mark, you know, I believe in you, I believe in this book, but I don't want to deal with these lawyers if they come after us. So he ended up getting the book published. It's available, but it was published by this tiny press in Maine called Common Courage Press. And you know, it's great that it's out there, but it's very different to have a book out there by what might be perceived as more lefty or more fringe press than what it would have been perceived coming from a mainstream press. And that was all about pressure from the company. And I remember when my dad asked the publisher if he had an insurance policy, you know, that would help him if Monsanto lawyers came after the publisher. The publisher said, Mark, we don't need an insurance policy. We've got the First Amendment. But you know, that's just one story. And again, it brings up this question of what's all the stories we're not hearing? What are all the books that are not being published? Who are all the journalists who are not reporting on this because they're afraid to do what you did, Carey, which is stand up to them?
Well, and not the journalists, not just journalists, but scientists. I mean, there are so many scientists that I talk to who, you know, they don't want their grants messed up. They don't want to be in trouble with that, you know. They just kind of want to keep their head down and do the work that they're doing and do it without ruffling a lot of feathers. And I've talked to so many who say, gosh, you know, I can't talk about this, or I can't share my research, or my research is shifting. It's too hot of a subject. And there's one scientist, and I'm not going to name her right now, but I am working on some stories about a pesticide, not glyphosate, and I really want to talk to her. She's been a leading scientist in this particular field, in this particular area of study related to pesticides. And what I've been told from her friends, because she will not return any of my messages, is that she has been harassed and she feels like stalked, and she just doesn't think that it's safe to be speaking publicly about her research right now, which is a terrible thing, right? It's a terrible thing. But it's the pressure and it's the intent of these chemical companies to silence anyone that they can who is perceived as a threat, you know, spreading the message or information or scientific research. Well, we also see in terms of scientists, and we've seen this at least a couple of times, I can think of 2 or 3 times recently, scientists who are going to advise the Environmental Protection Agency, who sit on these scientific advisory panels to the EPA. And you see very clearly the moves by CropLife America, by the lobbying organization, and by these companies to get in there and influence who sits on these advisory panels to the EPA, who's telling them how to look at the science and what the science means. So that's another tactic. And unfortunately, pretty often we see that who they want to be on the panel is on the panel, and who they don't want to be advising the EPA is kicked off.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, there's actually a term, the chilling effect, for what this does, and to journalists, activists, and especially scientists. And it's worth remembering that the stories you hear, I mean, if you hear about Tyrone Hayes, who challenged Syngenta, or you hear about Carey Gillam, who stands up to Monsanto, or Rachel Carson, who goes after DDT, for every one of those, there are 99 people who have been chilled into silence. And that is the way in which power asserts itself. And it would be nice, I think, to imagine a world full of Carey Gillams. But the reality is that, especially scientists, they do not get into science to be in the heart of controversy. And so when they find that their work starts bringing them there, they often retreat into safer pastures. And this does have a really large scale and hard and difficult to measure impact on the sociology of science.
I think just to stick on this one more time, I'm going to share one more anecdote, I guess. So at Reuters, they back in, so it was 2011, 12, 13, when GMO labeling was really a thing, and we were seeing state moves around the country to pass laws for mandatory GMO labeling. And the glyphosate science was really heating up with these connections to glyphosate exposure and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. They really were trying to shut me down at Reuters and were pressuring this one new editor. And I remember this point, this was 2014-ish, this editor telling me, you know what, no one cares about glyphosate. It's never going to be a story. We need to just stop writing about glyphosate. And that was 100% because of the pressure that he was getting on a regular basis from Monsanto and the industry. And, of course, I said, no, you don't see the science building. Like, this is going to explode, which it did in 2015 when the International Agency for Research on Cancer declared it to be a probable human carcinogen. But he really wanted us to just stop writing about GMOs and stop writing about glyphosate, because the industry was telling him, you know what, there's nothing to hear. And he was believing that. So that happens in news outlets everywhere.
The other thing
Go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to jump in there and say, to pick up your point, and Carey, about the scientific panels. So one of the things that PAN does quite regularly is we sit on expert panels as observers for whether it's the FAO or WHO or UNEP or international bodies. And when we turn up as a naive young scientist, I came out, I believed in evidence-led policymaking until I encountered these scientific panels, because as you say, they're totally dominated by different actors, and we're an observer. So I'll turn up there, and as PAN, as the only NGO in the room, and there'll be people from CropLife. There'll be 10 people from CropLife, and they'll all be lawyers. They won't be technical experts. They'll all be lawyers going into the detail of clause 4 and trying to find ways to block and change things. So it's not even about the dirty tricks that goes on in the dark shadows. It's really about how they manipulate the existing transparent processes as well.
Yeah, and just a note, we've mentioned this name CropLife a few times. So for those listening who might not be familiar with this classic trade group from the industry, it is formerly known as the National Agricultural Chemical Association, which might be a little bit more clear than the name CropLife, but it's a trade group that has CropLife International that works globally in the interests of the agrochemical sector, and then has affiliates in many countries around the world, and CropLife America being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, Jennifer, I interrupted you. Please go ahead.
No, I think it's worth building off. All of these things that you're talking about, of course, don't exist only in agrochemicals. They are playbooks that get shared primarily through PR firms across industries. And so when you look at the makeover of CropLife, right? I mean, this happened in tanning beds. It happened in fisheries. It's happened in tobacco, where you'll have a trade association that starts to get a bad reputation, and so it will just dissolve and rename itself. And that's just something you just see. It's a smoke and mirror tactic. And the one thing I've noticed from my sort of bird's eye view of these different industries is that agrochemicals do play dirtier than some of the other industries when it comes to attacking reputations. And so that does present a challenge, especially to the scientists. For whatever reason, the PR firms that they hire are sort of meaner or the strategic communications that they hire. I haven't seen, I mean, we're fortunate that we live in countries where they're, they're attacking our reputations. But as Carey knows, they're also attacking people physically in other countries, other parts of the world. And that, we haven't seen, for instance, I haven't seen the tobacco industry use those kind of tactics, but I've seen and heard about it with agrochemicals in places like Argentina and Brazil.
One thing I was interested about is the role of whistleblowers, and why aren't there more whistleblowers in coming out? I mean, it must be scary enough being an independent journalist, but if you're in an industry and you're making your living from it, the question should be is why are there whistleblowers?
Anna might be better positioned to. I think there's a lot of answers to that. I authored I have included it in Whitewash, but I also authored a textbook chapter looking at the history of the EPA. And you do see this sort of corruption and this corporate influence over science dating back almost to, the very beginning of the EPA, and it crosses over many different chemicals and many different administrations. It's a bipartisan problem, certainly, but you do see a history of scientists trying to raise their hand, trying to blow the whistle, trying to push back, and they very rarely are successful. There are some situations. There was a woman several years ago who, really fought and lost her job and fought and got her job back and that sort of thing. And you see that happen, but they very rarely, are covered in glory and success when they do come out and blow the whistle. It's not an easy process, and they're certainly not rewarded for it, other than we all are very appreciative for the little bit we learned. Now, there are 4, I believe it is, scientists that recently, it's been about a year ago now, I think, came out from inside the EPA, showing with text messages and emails and other communications, really showing a very worrisome degree of, again, corporate influence over the science that these EPA scientists are doing to try to protect all of us. And you see them being told to change the way that they're doing this so that they don't find that it causes cancer, so that they don't report that, when in fact they believe the science shows that it does. I mean, it's really, really just horrible stuff. And our different administrations have tried, the Obama said, we're really going to push our scientific integrity policy, and we're going to encourage people to report and make clear on these things. And it just never really seems to work out for us. And I think it's this fundamental problem of we have too much money in Washington, D.C. We allow money to dominate who our lawmakers are, who sits in office, who's appointing these political appointees to run the EPA and other agencies. It's just, when you let money and wealthy corporations have that much power and influence, your regulatory agencies are by very nature going to be corrupted, I think. And we certainly are. We certainly have evidence that our EPA is deeply corrupted when it comes to scientific integrity.
Anna, do you think this is just a US phenomena?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think what we've already touched on a little bit in this conversation is just, well, what a global industry we're talking about. But as Jennifer was talking about, this isn't just about the agrochemical sector. All the things we're talking about, this kind of industry playbook, all these different tactics, many of them quite dirty, cross sectors from tobacco to the fossil fuel industry. And what you see is that many of the same front groups and also many of the same PR agencies. I mean, you talked, Jennifer, about maybe how a little bit dirtier the ones working for agrochemical industry are, but groups like Fleischmann Hillard and Ketchum and FTI Consulting and the Lincoln Strategy Group and Red Flag Consulting, if you look up these firms, they have clients from the fossil fuel sector, they have clients from agrochemical sector and more. And they're not just targeting, trying to influence regulation in the US or in the UK. They're really looking at countries around the world. And they're also really looking at the global level as well. So one of the things that I know Pesticide Action Network has been a real leader on is exposing how CropLife International, again, you've heard us mention this name a few times. They are the trade group for agrochemical companies globally, how they entered into a partnership, a public partnership with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And civil society groups around the world, I think in the end, it was maybe 430 civil society and indigenous peoples organizations globally pushed back and said, the UNFAO should be working on behalf of the public interest, and having that kind of corporate alliance and having that kind of corporate partnership at the highest level really undermines the integrity of the science, the integrity of the priorities of the institution. And I know that that conversation with FAO is ongoing. That partnership still stands at the moment. And I think it's a good example. Well, it's a good example of a bad thing, but it's a good example of how industry is really trying to, again, not just work country by country, but really trying to influence global strategy and global priorities, particularly of the FAO.
Yeah. And this is a bit of a strange one, really, but what is the psychology of people who work for the pesticide industry? I mean, I do not subscribe to everyone's a baddie and things like that. So I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of people who work in this sector. So why do they work in this sector?
Let's go to the professor for that, right? And Jennifer.
I mean, I'm often thinking about motivations, and it was one of the reasons why I wrote the playbook from a corporate perspective, because I thought, oh, if I adopt this kind of view, this singular lens of trying to make money, can I make more sense of all of this? Do things fall out of this? And in a way, challenging science that challenges your business operation is very much, it's like, how do you have child labor in your supply chain? How do you have tax havens that don't support your local schools where your kids go to school? How do you justify, I mean, there are so many bad business practices essentially, and they're all justified by this kind of short-term focus on profit and greed, ultimately, that the corporation as an institution codifies, right, through this idea of fiduciary duty. And so then you ask, well, what are the motivations of the people within the firm? Which it's very clear that they might have personal values that don't map onto that. They themselves may not reject climate science or even the science of pesticide use. They themselves may not use Roundup on their own yards because they're worried about the health effects, but they can work for Monsanto, who spreads these chemicals around the world. And that's been shown time and time again to be that kind of level of cognitive dissonance to be pretty easy to justify to oneself. I think where things get interesting is when you have the corporation, that's clear, like what their goal is. We want to sell as much of this to as many people as possible. But then the PR firm is a different, it's a kind of different entity. So it is not motivated by deception. It's not motivated by market share. It's merely working for a client, in this case, the pesticide industry. And so I tend to think of PR firms, as bullshitters, that they are, in the philosophical sense of the term bullshit, where bullshit is not false, it's phony. It is neither on the side of the true or the false. It may be right, it may be wrong. The point is it's work for hire. Mm-hmm. And so in a PR firm, you're not asked to understand the science or to understand even your client's motives. You're just asked to put together kind of the best, glossiest argument, almost like a Marvel movie, or the best challenge to Carey Gillam, as if you were potentially evil. The question of who Carey Gillam is, I'm sure, doesn't cross the PR firm's mind. They're tasked with going after Carey Gillam, and they do it in the best way that they can possible. And so that is a very, I think, a kind of different mindset than actually having to be the strategy. And so when people in my world want to sort of recenter PR firms at the center of scientific denial, I still think that the corporation, the businesses, the industry is the oil that keeps that world going. And so that just helps kind of clarify motives. And everybody in these jobs are just trying to, make money, I assume, and, go to Hawaii every now and then on vacation. It's not particularly egregious. And it helps explain, too, why there aren't more whistleblowers. I think most people aren't thinking very deeply about their role in this big machinery. Part of the machinery is very much almost like a slaughterhouse, is to work on your small section of this huge playbook and to not think about it strategically across. So it's like, well, you just need to make an advertisement, right? That talks about how Monsanto is feeding the world. You don't have to think about all the other things that are going on as part of this bigger puzzle.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and that was, yeah, so I totally agree, Jennifer, with how you were describing it. And I would add, there's such such incentives to do this work, such financial incentives to do this work, and such glory to be had if you're not actually, deeply aligned with trying to create a world that is more healthy for all. I mean, I think about Carey going to the closing arguments for the first glyphosate case, Johnson versus Monsanto, and hearing the closing arguments from the lawyer who was, at that point it was Bayer, but, working on behalf of the company. And he was very charismatic, very convincing, very authoritative. And, he spun a tale of how actually the science was sound and how actually we don't need to be worried about this weed killer, and actually the crippling cancer of the man sitting in front of him was not at all related to this chemical that we know is linked to exactly the cancer this man had. And I remember going home that evening and Googling this lawyer to understand who he was, and his bio on his firm's website, in its very first sentence about him, proud, with prideful glory, was saying that he had gotten some prize by some lawyers association for the work that he did on behalf of, guess who? The tobacco industry in the state of Missouri. There had been a case filed by the state of Missouri against Philip Morris for marketing light cigarettes as healthier for you, which we all know is not true. And he had defended the tobacco industry. Jury deliberated for, I think, 30 minutes against this $1.5 billion class action lawsuit. The jury, 30 minutes, found them not guilty. Meanwhile, what is it, 30,000 or something people die every year in Missouri from smoking, from use of tobacco. And this was, his most proud moment was that he won that case. And so I think it is that cognitive dissonance you're describing, Jennifer, of like how he could really set aside what are the real world implications of his actual work in the world, and that he was getting all of these accolades, not to mention the financial benefits of taking that position. But yeah, I think about lawyers like that and all the incentives set up to have him continue to do that work.
Anna, I would just throw a little irony in there. So in this litigation, Monsanto filed what they call motions in limine, but it was basically an objection. They did not want the plaintiff's attorneys to compare Monsanto to the tobacco industry, should not in any way make any sort of comparative statements, because that would, that would be too hard.
That would bias the jury.
Right. Too biased. And yet the lawyer, as you said, for Monsanto, was very successful in defending the tobacco industry. I thought
right.
that was...
And let's be clear, nobody on the jury could know that, right? They were instructed, you cannot research anything. You can't even look in a thesaurus when you're sitting on this jury. So nobody could do what I did that evening, Google this guy and find out what his background was. Nobody on the jury.
But if we know this, if we know that the industry has this playbook and the industry has these tactics, and so why do regulators, why do governments fall for it? That's an open question.
Well, again, I mean, there's any number we've talked about money, revolving doors, right? I was talking to a government scientist over the weekend, worked for the US government for 40 years. One of our scientists said, the EPA is just entirely corrupted. Why? Again, money and power, and people at the top, can do very well for themselves by being very friendly to this industry that they regulate, and finding consulting jobs or full-time positions. You don't only see that at EPA, but a number of other of our regulatory agencies. We encourage it, by our lax policies and policies in Washington, D.C. We've set up a system that empowers the wealthy and at the expense of us everyday taxpayers.
I think it's also worth noting that the right in the US especially, but almost everywhere, and these companies share a very common goal, which is the shrinking and elimination, really, of regulatory structure of government itself. And so the industry, regardless of how directly it contributes to things like ALEC or any other kind of bill mills that attempt to shrink regulatory power, they are, you see common bedfellows there between what is essentially, the Republican Party as it currently stands and the Monsantos of the world. So when you've had, at least in the US and of course the UK to some extent, over the last 50 years, a real push to debilitate government politically, and then the industry is, of course, benefiting from that. You have a 1-2 punch that is just very hard to come back from.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, because I think I absolutely agree with both of you, and I think this kind of long arc over the decades of the attempt to dismantle the regulatory state that benefits in all different sectors of the economy is really important to shine a light on, and not to get too dark for all of us to, because I like to turn my eye to look at where are there efforts and advocates and communities that are trying to organize to push back against that and trying to organize to get people elected into office who actually represent the public interest and aren't going to be influenced by industry in such a way. And folks who are going into public service, going into these agencies to try to repair the regulatory apparatus that has been so underfunded, under-resourced, and so influenced by industry. And I think a really good example of where we're seeing this happen is the Hawaiian Islands, which some of you may know has become ground zero for agrochemical testing for new genetically modified crops, largely chosen by the industry because it is so far from, I think the nearest EPA office is San Francisco, but it's and so much of the jobs on many of the islands that have ag land are tied to these monoculture production of these GMO crops. And over the years, as communities tried to organize to pass common sense pesticide regulation, they kept finding that they were really up against local governments that had been so influenced by industry. And over time, they realized that the only way they're really going to be able to build enough power to actually pass common sense pesticide regulation was to start inspiring people to run for office and inspiring community groups to advocate for really strong pesticide policy. And it wasn't easy, and it's an ongoing process, of course, but we're starting to see things like Hawaii was the first state in the United States to pass a statewide ban on this really terrible insecticide known as chlorpyrifos, which scientists tell us there's no known safety level for exposure for children. They've passed a number of other pesticide policies that, again, I see as very commonsensical. But again, I just kind of want to bring this in as an example of where we're starting to see, what gives me hope is starting to see that kind of movement. And to me, frankly, Keith, groups like Pesticide Action Network around the world also is really on the forefront of this. And, when we look at the trends, I think pesticide use is up like 86% in the past couple decades. Certain places like South America up 500%. I mean, the numbers are alarming, but that doesn't mean that we should be so demoralized that we don't see that there's ways that we can really influence and really improve the kind of regulatory protections that we need.
I was going to ask what people think, because as you say, it can be quite depressing. It is quite a grim picture that we're painting. But what can be done to rein in the power or counter the power of the pesticide industry?
Well, I can jump in, but I was just talking. Jennifer, do you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, I do think that, I sort of make a joke in the book that, oh, one threat to industry, of course, is the idea that everyone starts to learn about the playbook. And, we're a little worried about a book that's coming out and it's attached as a manuscript here, and it's the book. Like, it's supposed to be a joke, a kind of meta joke. But I think that my point is dead serious, which is the more that we all wise up, right, to these patterns, and the more that we all start forming coalitions, right, that the Pesticide Action Network is working with those working on, the beef and dairy sector, and those working against tobacco, and those working against fossil fuels, because it's an us versus them idea. And the coalitions that they have built, of course, through the right-wing think tanks and all of these PR firms, and they share this common goal of reducing the regulatory structure. I think we have to be also wise in building a coalition and recognizing those patterns and fighting against them in strategic ways. Again, because we have the numbers. If democracy holds up, the numbers are on our side, the dollars are on theirs. And this is just what we know about. At least if you live in America, you're used to those odds. And so I'm heartened that there are things that we can do, because I do believe that almost everything that I see, every issue, and especially the ones you're talking about, even the things you just mentioned, Hawaii, Anna, it's just like we have the public on our side. That's huge, but we don't have the power.
Yeah, and it's exactly because we have the numbers that this whole playbook exists, because they knew if people really understood the science, if they really understood what was at stake, if they really knew the facts, right, that we would all say, why are we allowing pesticides to be used to the extent that they are? We would say it's completely crazy that this most recent Pesticide Action Network study, where they tried to estimate, what is a % of farmers and farm workers using pesticides that have an acute pesticide poisoning incident every year, and found that it's almost half of everybody using pesticides has some kind of acute poisoning incident at least once a year. That's a staggering number. If more people understood that, and more people understood that pesticides actually just trap us into a pesticide treadmill, and if more people understood that pesticides are just another branch of the fossil fuel industry, and it's an escape hatch for climate, if the industry continues to see the pressures from wind and solar to electrify everything, they're increasingly looking to plastics, to agrochemicals like pesticides and fertilizers. And so absolutely, that kind of alliance building you described, Jennifer, is so critical.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really glad we finished on quite a positive note, because as you said, it can be a bit grim. But I mean, I too am quite optimistic about the future, not least because, I mean, we know that these aren't necessary. I think there's a very famous saying, like, the Stone Age didn't come to an end because of a lack of stones. We know there are alternatives out there, and these alternatives are cheaper and make more sense for the environment and for farmers. As soon as we can make it work for farmers, then we're going to win. But also, I do believe that people are taking control. If governments let us down, then people are taking control. In the UK here, we have literally hundreds of local pesticide-free towns campaigns, which are grassroots campaigns trying to get pesticides to local authorities to stop using them. And it's only been going for a few years, but already we've got dozens of local authorities taking action where the government won't. We've got in our projects, PAN runs projects in the Global South. As I said, the alternatives are available, and our projects are massively oversubscribed with farmers who want to learn how to use pesticides less. And I think the other thing that really encourages me is actually it's going to start costing the money. We're already seeing the industry being hit with lawsuits. As you mentioned, what was the lawsuit about Dwayne Johnson. This is a huge risk for the industry. This is billions of dollars of liability. We've seen share prices fall off the cliff. And when this happens, investors start running scared and industry starts saying we have to do something safer and less risky. So I'm quite optimistic. And I really hope that I'm not in the same job doing the same thing in 20 years' time and we've got it solved. But I think all that is for me to do now is to say thank you so much to our speakers. I mean, it's been an amazing talk. I have learned so much and it's been inspiring. So thank you so much, and please keep doing what you're doing. You're great. Thanks.
Thank you.